Get started, Greg.
All
It's
right.
yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that heads up. Wasn't sure if we were quite live yet, but I appreciate everyone joining today for an interview tutorial session. Round one interviews are essentially upon us, as many applicants out there know. Depending on where you applied, you've potentially started to get some of those interview invites. Certain schools, if you applied early, like Darden, or if you hit Tuck September 1st deadline, you might have even have done a couple of interviews already. But nevertheless, we welcome you to this interview session, how to ace your MBA interview. We'll go full screen on the little presentation there in just a moment. My name is Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep. Avanti Prep is an MBA admissions consulting firm. We've been around now for a few years. And work with clients around the world on all elements, essentially, of their applications, from school selection and story development to essay brainstorming, essay reviews, resume reviews, recommender selection and recommendation strategy, and, of course, interview prep. And our interview prep is extremely thorough and extremely comprehensive. It's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time focusing on. I'll switch here now into the full screen. So just throwing this out there, I guess you could call it a shameless plug. We do have an interview prep service. It is 3 hours in duration. You could read more about it and all of Avanti Prep services on avantiprep.com. That 3 hours for interview prep, we'll kind of scratch the surface on some of what we cover there today in a, I guess you could say, higher level fashion. But those 3 hours, what we do with those is we do an extended mock interview in the specific style of the school that we're practicing for together, or that you're prepping for. As you are likely familiar, each school has its own distinct interview style. Question patterns, this is something we're going to talk about today. Some kind of have a typical or common or mainstream interview style, but there are others that have very distinct interview styles. And we'll talk a little bit about that today. So we do an extended mock interview in the style of each school, which lasts about an hour. Even if the real interview is often something like 30 to 40 minutes, we do a longer one to get more prep, to cover more questions, to get more rehearsal in. And then we do about a 2-hour question by question coaching, feedback, and strategy session. Again, it's extremely thorough and comprehensive. I think a lot of people risk sometimes under preparing for interviews. You don't want to, you're not there to script answers and things like that, but there's a lot to think about, a lot to digest. And again, we'll cover that today. avantiprep.com if you're interested in learning more about interview prep or reading any of our reviews or testimonials about them. So we'll spend about 25 or 30 minutes here on covering the basics of how to ace your MBA interview. And then we'll slide into questions for the final 20 or 30 minutes. And we'll go for, maybe a good part of an hour or an hour or so. Here's a little bit of an agenda for today's video. The first is just, some of the basics, some things to think about, some things to keep in mind for your MBA interview. And then we'll cover 3 very common question types. What I refer to as core questions, behavioral questions, and self-awareness questions. This terminology, other than behavioral, is sort of my own making. Core questions, behavioral questions, self-awareness questions. But as we'll talk about, I think if you look at the landscape of questions that you get in a typical MBA interview, they generally fall into these 3 buckets. So that's what we'll walk through today. The other piece, if I had to pick a 4th piece, by the way, would be the questions that you ask the interviewer usually at the end of the interviewer as well. So just keeping those in mind, and we'll see if we have time to cover those. We could talk a little bit about them. Noted there in italics at the bottom of the slide is the fact that what we'll cover today will mostly be in and around the standard MBA interview, the most common type of MBA interview. But as I alluded to a moment ago when talking about Avanti Prep's own interview prep service, each school has a distinct interview style. Many use the common interview, the standard interview. There are some, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Darden, to name a few, that have very distinct interview styles. They kind of stray from the standard. And then even within the standard interviews, there are different question patterns and different nuances associated with each. This segues nicely into the next slide you see up there on your screen, highlighted in blue at the very top. One of the first things you want to think about when you get invited to interview or you schedule an interview with a given program is not just to research the school. Hopefully you've researched the school very, very heavily at that point. If you've already applied, you'll want to have researched the school and understood its values and understood its offerings and understood its curriculum, its culture, its community, how you fit with it, how you could contribute. Hopefully you've done a lot of that already. Talk to current students, talk to alumni, talk to colleagues perhaps who have gone there. You'll want to freshen up on all of that for the interview. But equally important, I would encourage people as a first step to research the interview format and the interview reports for that program. And this goes back to what I was saying before about each school having potentially a distinct interview style, or even if they have a core interview, kind of a traditional, common, standard MBA interview, there are nuances that you'll see and question patterns and even question frequencies that you'll observe within them. So you want to do your homework, and that's something even with clients we encourage them to sort of do themselves, which is if you go on gmatclub.com, there's a great interview debrief page where you can filter by program, by MBA program, and you'll find written reports of real life interview questions for a given school. You could filter by Darden, you could filter by Ross, you could filter by Berkeley Haas, my alma mater, and you'll see what real life candidates who interviewed, a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, 2 months ago, even 2 years ago, have reported as the questions that they were asked. You want to study these patterns. I think we encourage people we work with, and I'll encourage all of you out there. You might even want to build a document. I mean, look through several of those interview reports. There are a variety of other resources. If you just Google, such and such name of a school and the word MBA interview report, you'll find other reports online as well. And if you you don't have to look at a million interview reports, but if you triangulate between enough of them and enough recent interview reports, as well as read the school's own description of their interview on their website. Some have distinct interview pages, what they're looking for, how they structure the interview. Others have videos about their interviews and what to think about, and again, how they structure it, what they look for. If you triangulate all of this information, and again, possibly even build a document of the questions that you see and the questions you see most frequently, you will, in doing that, begin to understand and really start to think about even what are the types of questions I'm likely to encounter over the course of this, over the course of that interview. And again, how do they vary between schools? Sometimes vary greatly, sometimes on a more nuanced basis. I think that if you do that too, you can think about bucketing the questions you observe into the three categories I mentioned earlier: the core questions, behavioral questions. Behavioral questions are example driven. Tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. So core questions, behavioral questions, and then what I call self-awareness questions. You might have a miscellaneous category as well, but you could triangulate all of these things, build yourself a blueprint. And in doing so, again, part of the exercise, part of the rationale for undertaking that exercise yourself is because in the act of doing it, you are sort of giving yourself a little mini PhD in what the question patterns are, what the question frequencies are, what the flow of the interview is for a given school. What's the most common opening question? What are the most common behavioral questions? There's no guarantee, of course, that you get those exact questions in the real life interview, but at least you're doing your homework and building a framework from the very, very beginning. Up on the screen there, you'll see a variety of other reminders as well. Just to call out a few things here: clarity and consistency. I think you want to be clear in your remarks and consistent with your applications. Most interviews are blind, which means the interviewer has only seen your resume, not the rest of your application. So you're free to use all the stories and anecdotes and so forth from the rest of your application, but you want to be consistent. You don't want to talk about, you want to be consistent with what was in your essays and your applications. You don't want to talk about tech goals in your interview and you had investment banking goals in your applications. You want to be consistent, of course. By the way, there are some interviews out there that are not blind. MIT Sloan is what's called a comprehensive interview. Harvard Business School has what's called a comprehensive interview, where they have actually read through and digested all elements of your application, and you can get some very specific questions about parts of those. Other end of the coin, by the way, Virginia Darden. That's a completely blind interview. They haven't even looked at your resume. They've looked at nothing, theoretically speaking. So clarity, consistency, structure without being scripted, specificity while maintaining succinctness, I think are all key elements as well. So just some reminders there up on the screen. Have questions ready. We'll talk more about that, time permitting. Send a thank you email at the end of the interview. Be confident but humble. Avoid self-centeredness. Avoid self-aggrandizement. Avoid a take attitude. Avoid a me-centric attitude. It's not an opportunity. It's not a contest to like report all of your greatest accomplishments and, you know, talk about like list awards and brag about yourself. There, you want to be confident but humble. You want to talk about your experiences in a thoughtful way. If you've got awards and you've got things you've won, I mean, they might come up in the course of an interview, but they're on your resume. They're in your recommendations. They're going to be seen in your application. This is an opportunity not to, you know, you're not there to brag, to spend 30 minutes to an hour bragging about yourself. You're there to have a thoughtful discussion that very authentically reveals who you are, your goals, your fit with the school, what's shaped you, key examples from your life, what you learned from those examples, how you think others perceive you, how you perceive yourself. And we'll get into all of that. I've mentioned a few times here the core questions. So what do I mean by that? I would say that for the typical MBA interview, you want to think about 5 core questions and almost universally be prepared to answer these core 5 questions. There's kind of 4 buckets here on the screen. I'll explain what I mean by the 5th in a moment. Those 5 core questions are listed there. The first one, tell me about yourself. Sometimes walk me through your resume. This is an open introductory question. It's kind of an icebreaker that kicks off the conversation. We'll try to hit a couple of bullet points on this, and just in the interest of time, we could take more pointed questions about each of these during the Q&A portion of this. Biggest pitfall I see with this question, by the way, not every school asks it in exactly this way. MIT Sloan, for example, might typically ask, what's changed since your application? Or are there any updates since your application? Virginia Darden might have you kind of launch into a big tell me about yourself that kind of governs or dictates the entirety of the conversation. But in most cases, in many cases, for common MBA interviews, the first question you receive is either tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. The biggest pitfall we see with applicants in this is people launching into 8 or 10 minute monologues about themselves that go down a variety of rabbit holes and go into tremendous detail about themselves and their experiences. What we want to do here instead, in almost all cases, is target more of a, let's say, 2-minute opener. Maybe if it ticks toward 2.5, 3 minutes, that could probably be okay too. But have that kind of 2-minute, 2.5-minute bogey in your head. I like for people to think about this as the movie trailer version of you. Movie trailers are typically around 2.5, 3 minutes, whatever the case may be. This is the overarching summary. It's a getting to know you. You're setting the stage for the conversation, setting the stage for who you are. You can click down into specific examples and specific details during the course of the interview, and or the interview will ask you questions in order to do that. We'll want to keep moving through these things and not spending too much time in any one area. But if I'm thinking about a structure to this response, you might think of trying to break it into 4 little buckets. A first bucket could be who you are, where you're from, where you went to college, what you studied, why you chose to study that. So kind of where you're from, college, what you studied, why you studied it, college activities. You don't have to go into tremendous detail about any of those things. Again, this is the movie trailer version, the summary version, the introductory version of you. You might, if you've had 2 jobs, you might then step into how did I get that first job, transition into that first job? Why did I take that job? What interested in me about it? What does the company do, especially if it's not clear? What was I responsible for in my role? And perhaps one highlight, a 1-sentence highlight, biggest thing I learned, most memorable experience from 1 sentence. You could share the whole experience, the whole example later on during the interview. After 3 years of working as a blank, I saw an opportunity where I developed an interest in, and now you're transitioning into the second job and you'll do the same thing there. You transition into the second job. What does the company do? What did you do? 1-sentence highlight. Now transition into outside of work. Outside of work, I'm really passionate about. What are you involved in? Things like that. So there you have a potential, just one way to do it. But if you're looking for a little bit of organization and a little bit of preparation, how do I cluster my response? How do I make it easy to follow? How do I discipline myself from a length perspective? You could have that opening piece, where you're from, college, what you studied, maybe a little bit about what you were involved in. Modulate that if you were really involved in something that was very, very heavy and life-changing during college. You could add a little more color to that, but that's the first piece. Job, transition into job one, transition into job two, outside of work, blank. That's one way to do it. It's not the only way to do it. That's tell me about yourself. What are your career goals? What are your short and long-term career goals? That's another very common question to get during an MBA interview that you should absolutely be prepared for. The 3 pieces I like for people to remember and think about here are to make sure you're sharing detail about your short-term goals, your long-term goals, if you've asked about them. And the third part that's not really asked in the question, but it is essentially asked in the question is, why are these goals your goals? What's the passionate purpose behind them? What's your interest behind them? How did these come to be your goals? What's the big picture problem or the business problem or even the quasi-social or social problem that you're looking to solve? So 3 pieces there. What are your short-term goals? Make sure you answer that. What are your long-term goals? Make sure you answer that. And what is the passionate purpose behind these goals? Sometimes there's even maybe an interim step or a medium step between the short and long-term goals. Doesn't necessarily need to be in that order, by the way. For some people, if the long-term goals are really what drives things, they might start with the long-term goals and then back into the short-term goals. But those are the things to make sure you capture there. Be really specific. This is true in your applications and in your interviews. You don't want to just say, I want to go into finance. You don't want to just say, I want to go into consulting. Let's use consulting as the example. I'd like to go into consulting. Well, what you might start as a generalist. You're going to join a lot of MBAs. They come out of MBA programs. They join a consulting firm as a generalist. They're covering for 2 years. They're covering a variety of industries, variety of functions, variety of different projects. But after serving as a generalist, what industry expertise do you hope to develop? What functional expertise? Do you want to transition after you're a generalist into a certain group within McKinsey or Deloitte? Well, which one and why that one? And what do you hope to work on? And what do you hope to solve there? In other industries, think about not just, again, what the industry is, but what are the companies that you hope to recruit for? What are the roles at those companies? What teams within those companies? And why? Not so many whys that you talk forever, but within this framework of short, long, and passionate purpose behind. Think about overlaying that specificity. Again, be consistent with your applications and so forth. Logically, if we think about this kind of logically, what would come next in a sequence of questions? Not always in this order. And if we have time, we could talk about how to be nimble on some of this. But another question you always want to be prepared for a core MBA interview is why MBA, why now? This is the third of the core 5. Why MBA, why now? Kind of a hybrid or a double question in there. When we think about why MBA, I like for people to think about I've just shared my goals. And by the way, if they go straight to why MBA and you haven't shared your goals yet, you probably want to preface with your goals here because your why MBA exists in context of what those goals are. So let's pretend for a second that you did answer the goals question just a moment ago. You've shared your short and long-term goals and why those are your goals, and what you hope to work on and what you hope to solve and what impact you hope to have. Then you get the question, why MBA, why now? Well, given the goals that I just described, I feel that I've already got a solid foundation in A, B, C, and D. Given my goals as I've described them, I've already got a foundation in a few areas, a few knowledge, skill, and experience areas that are relevant to these goals. That's kind of a preface to your response. You're basically saying, I've told you my goals. Now I'm going to tell you, I thankfully, over my last 6 years working at JP Morgan, I've been able to develop a strong and relevant foundation in A, B, C, and D. You're not going into a tremendous detail on these things because that's not the question. The question is why MBA. You're just setting up why MBA by saying, I've got a foundation in A, B, C, D. But as I look ahead to these goals, I feel that I have several key gaps that I need to fill through a full-time MBA. Or however exactly you want to word that, of course. You've told them your goals. You've said, I've got a foundation in A, B, C, D, but I need an MBA because I'm missing E, F, G, H. Those gaps, those crystallized gaps are your why MBA. This is true, by the way, and it should be true ideally in your essays, your career goals essays and stuff as well. And that E, F, G, H, I put letters to them. It might sound overly structured or overly algebraic, but I put letters to them because I really want you to crystallize those. Just as you might crystallize the A, B, C, D knowledge, skills, and experience that you already have, I'd like you to crystallize the gaps. Really think specifically about you and your skill set and what your goals are. And think about what gaps you therefore have that you would need to fill to go from where you are now to where you hope to go in the future. The MBA is that missing link in between. And those E, F, G, H gaps are why you need an MBA. If you were looking to kind of think about categories that you could potentially assign there, could E be a knowledge or hard skill gap? Could F be a hands-on experience gap? Could G be a leadership development gap or growing as a person, team member, and a leader? Could H be something related to community, alumni network, recruiting opportunities? Community, by the way, could go into that third bucket alongside leadership development. The community of an MBA program is kind of the crucible through which you develop as a person, team member, and leader. But just to throw a few hypotheticals out there, that's the preponderance of your answer, is what those gaps are, and elaborate by saying, don't just name the gaps, elaborate by articulating them in context of you. Maybe you've got some on-job training in certain things, but you've not formalized your, I'll give an example just to carry this one forward. Somebody who maybe has a bachelor's degree in engineering, worked in finance, worked in asset management, wants to go into investment banking. They've got some on-job financial experience, but if they want to transition to, which is relevant, that's nice, that's part of their ABCD. But if they want to transition into investment banking, well, some of the hard skills, some of that E gap that they're missing are going to be hard skills, hard knowledge. Well, maybe they've been exposed to a little bit around what M&A means, but they were a science major in undergrad. They got to fill in that bucket, through the MBA. That's a little bit of a sloppy example, but an example nevertheless. Why MBA? Why now? Next question in this kind of logical flow. Why our program? Why Ross? Why Berkeley Haas? Why Columbia? Why Kellogg? I'd like here for you to think about carrying forward that EFGH construct that you developed for the previous response for why MBA. And what you're doing here is going to very specifically articulate how the program you're interviewing with fills each of those buckets. I mentioned knowledge, experience, leadership development, community, alumni network, recruiting, whatever those buckets are for you. Could be international opportunities in there as well, or location, whatever the case may be. I'd like you to talk about here, or think about here, carrying that EFGH construct forward, but now filling in the specifics around how each program uniquely, or how the program you're interviewing with uniquely fills those gaps. And what you'll want to do here is cover a variety of things. Again, if certain things are knowledge related and other things are experience related, and other things are leadership development related, and other things are community or alumni network or recruiting related, you've established a blueprint through which you can hit on pretty distinct corners of the experience. Things that are maybe in classroom, other things that are out of classroom or experiential, club leadership, conference leadership, case competitions, extracurriculars, and importantly as well, culture, community, and fit. You don't want to walk away from this answer just having talked about or laundry listed specific offerings. This should be a hybrid in here, a combination of offerings and cultural, community, and I guess you could say more abstract fit elements. But that if E, F, G, H are your gaps, I'd like you to think about here, how does the program I'm interviewing with uniquely fill each of those gaps? Be ready to talk specifically about the program. You don't want a laundry list. You don't want to talk forever. That's where some of the mapping out and the discipline and the thoughtfulness of your answers comes in. It's not a contest for who can laundry list the most things. You want these to make sense in articulation, in aggregate articulation of these questions. What are your goals? Why MBA? Why now? And why our program? I say core 5 because I think highlighted in orange there's kind of a 5th core question in here. I didn't break it out specifically on the page, but what specific contributions will you make, or do you intend to make, or do you plan to make, or do you hope to make to a given program? You could do this within the why school question. I prefer when it's asked separately, and I think there are even ways or tactics through which you can kind of cover how the school fills your gaps toward your goals, EFGH, and then sort of transition into your contributions, and that way you're accomplishing a couple of things. You don't want the interviewer to walk away thinking that you're only going to be taking from the program. Again, we want to avoid take. Still, the program is going to be helping you achieve your goals in a unique way. You're making a case for that in the interview, but you also want to make sure it's clear how you're going to give. So looking for an opportunity, and sometimes it could even be by your own making at the end of your why XYZ school answer. You might say something like, I'm also be happy to share how I believe I can uniquely contribute to the Fuqua MBA program. And you could almost create your own little transition there and buy yourself the opportunity to go into a proper, deep, thorough, and specific response about how you believe you can uniquely contribute. Contributions, again, specificity. We don't just want to hear like you want to join a certain club or participate in a certain conference. Those would be pretty superficial or pretty rudimentary contributions. I'd like you to think about, are there 2 or 3 really unique contributions that you believe you can make to the program? Not unique in a self-aggrandizing, pat yourself on the shoulder kind of way, but think about your own experiences, your own perspectives, your own personal, professional background. Are there things that situations you've uniquely been in, people you've worked with, things you've been exposed to? How can you draw on those and kind of channel those into unique contributions at the school? Beyond just mentioning a club or a role or a conference or whatever, think about, put it this way, think about not just the role you'd seek in a given club, think about what you would do in that role. Is there something you'd expand? Is there something you'd create? Have you had, hopefully, conversations with people in these clubs or with people at the school who say, that club is really good at blank, but I think they could do this a little bit better. I think they could do mentorship a little bit better. Well, maybe you have a mentorship background and you have a tech background. So you think that if your president or head of community outreach for such and such a technology club. Maybe you could partner with with the school's Net Impact Club in order to launch a new mentorship program for, I don't know, undergrads and the rest of the university or people in the nearby community, things of that nature. So I really encourage you to think about, for your contributions, what unique things about yourself you can draw upon, and beyond just naming, I'm going to join a certain club or I'm going to have a certain role, tell them what you're going to do in that role. Have ideas, be creative, be inventive, think outside the box. How are you going to leave your imprint, a positive imprint, on the program to which you're applying? So those are core questions. We spent a lot of time there. We'll kind of go a little more quickly through the rest. Just as an example, I did before this video an extensive one of these interview prep sessions with a candidate applying to Fuqua. We did a mock interview on Friday. We did the coaching and feedback session today. And in probably 2.5 hours of coaching and feedback, we spent 90 minutes of those 2.5 hours on these 5 questions. They're super important. They are the foundation to any, essentially any application narrative, both in essays oftentimes as well as in interviews. But again, there are nuances between different schools. Not every school asks exactly these questions. Not all of them ask them. They ask them in different orders. They ask them in different ways. We could have a more advanced discussion around that maybe during the Q&A, or if anyone wants to sign up for interview prep, of course, we could get into the details on it. But that's the core 5, the 4 listed in bold, and then the orange is a 5th. Behavioral questions. Behavioral, again, it's kind of a funny word. I think before I was an MBA applicant myself, I didn't entirely know what people ever meant by behavioral questions. It basically means example-driven question. Tell me about a time when. Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you worked in a diverse setting. Tell me about a time you challenged the status quo, overcame a challenge, led a team, failed. Tell me about a time you received constructive feedback, gave constructive feedback. There's a whole host of behavioral questions. They can be, I guess you could say, a little harder to predict for a given school because the universe of potential behavioral questions is so wide open. But again, I mentioned it earlier, if you go and study those interview reports and those question patterns, you're going to pick up on frequencies. You're not going to have a perfect idea around which school asks which, but you might see, that program I'm interviewing with really seems to ask about working with diverse groups. Tell me about a time you led a diverse team or worked at a diverse team. They seem to ask that about 80% of the time. So I better be really prepared for that one. Once in a while, they ask about giving constructive feedback. I should have that in the back of my mind just in case, but if I were betting on it, it would be a low probability. So definitely study the patterns on behavioral questions. As far as preparing for these behavioral questions, there are a couple of rubrics here to keep in mind. The first is what I like to say to people: build a flexible bench of examples. Build a mental bench of examples. Sometimes I even say, take a piece of paper. Maybe it's a little bit old-fashioned of me to do it with actual paper rather than on digitally. But take a piece of paper, fold it into 4. You'll have 4 quadrants then on the front and back of the page. And think about what 4 examples, capsulized examples, could I take and would I take and want to share in an interview. I've got maybe my 4 main examples on the front of the page and 4 backup examples on the back of the page. You can tailor what those are to the common behavioral questions of the program. So again, some of the examples I just cited, you might in those capsules, 4 on the front of the page, 4 on the back, you could start to brainstorm, well, I probably need a working in diverse teams or leading diverse teams example. That should be one of the capsules. A failure example. A constructive feedback, receiving constructive feedback. How did you respond? What did you learn? Overcoming a challenge, disagreeing with a team member or a boss or team conflict. Again, you'll see the patterns and you could kind of figure out which belong on the page, what should I be brainstorming and what should I be ready for. I say flexible bench of examples because you don't need to tailor in your mind or have on that mental bench. You don't need to have one example for every single possible question that could come up. Again, you're going to see patterns in the interview reports. And on top of that, most of your examples can probably be nimble enough to answer a variety of things. A led a team example and an overcame a challenge example, well, maybe those could be the same thing, or the same example. You don't want to use, I would try not to use the same example twice in the same interview. But if you're going to get 2 or 3 or 4 behavioral questions, odds are you're not going to have to do that anyway. What I mean by flexible is you can take that example and just, overcome a challenge, lead a team. You might have been leading a team when you overcame a challenge. So either of those questions, you can use that example for. Leading a diverse team. Well, the diversity element, if it's a diversity related question, you could key in on those points. If it's more about leading a team, you could still kind of highlight some of those diversity themes within it. So build that mental bench of examples, that flexible bench of examples. Have some diversity within those examples, meaning try to have stuff from in work and outside of work. Listen to the question, by the way. Some schools once in a while, or some interviewers, will ask you to specify. They might say, tell me about a time you overcame a challenge at work. Well, then you have to give, have to give, I would say, a professional example for that. So, but have a mix of examples. Some professional, some from your community or leadership activities. That way, when the interviewer walks out of the interview, they don't say, gee, that person seemed really one-dimensional. Every time I asked them a question, they answered with, these kind of boring projects from work. Have some diversity. Make sure these different parts of you come across in those examples. And finally, structurally, you've built your mental bench of examples. You've got some diversity in them. How do you structure your delivery? Just as with those core questions, I see people, especially that first one, tell me about yourself. I see people fall in the bucket, so to speak, and talk for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, which is a big no-no. You want to keep these 2, maybe 3 minutes on the high end. Be concise. Sometimes thinking about structure can help you map out your thoughts, deliver your thoughts, and make what you're saying very digestible to the listener. A lot of people out there have probably heard of the STAR method, situation, task, action, result, or some people say SAR, situation, action, result. I have my own little take on this. It's called SCARL. It's more or less the same thing. MIT Sloan, which historically has done behavioral interviews, used to have on their website something that said, on their interview page, it said, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And let's think about how to structure your behavioral responses in that context. A beginning, a middle, and an end. When I think about SCARL, I think the beginning would be the S and the C, the situation of the challenges. When was this? What were we working on? 2 years ago, at JP Morgan, I was leading such and such an initiative. And we had to work with so-and-so and so-and-so. The big challenges were like, so situation and challenges are the beginning of the story. Actions are the middle of the story. What did you do? What steps did you take? I even sometimes say to people, not just actions, but actions, actions, actions. First we did this, then we did this, and finally we did this. So beginning, situation and challenges, middle, actions, 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 and then the end of the story would be the results / the lessons. And here's where I think in particular the value of SCARL comes into play over just STAR or SAR. You could look on the screen there if you could see it. The R is in parentheses. It's the result. It's worth noting. How did the story end? How did the project end? It's nice. But really the more interesting thing is, what did you learn? How did you grow? How did you change? What was the before and the after? So that's why I really like to make sure that L is on there. So beginning of the story, situation and challenges, middle, actions, 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 and end is results, mention them, but really reflections or lessons on top of that. And that hopefully can give you some structure and discipline around how to tell your story, how to keep it within, maybe a 2-minute box, excuse me, and how to make it very digestible for the listener. Keep in mind, sidebar, some schools have very, very deep, like Stanford GSB, excuse me, has a, pardon me, Stanford GSB has behavioral driven interviews, which are built around just a handful, like the whole interview pretty much is a handful of behavioral questions. So be ready with those, but they're really going to super probe you on these. So instead of in a typical interview, you might be doing, a 2.5 minute SCARL based response. Well, for a Stanford GSB, really behavioral focused interview, you might start telling that story and the interviewer is going to interrupt you and ask you to probe, well, when you start talking about that action, well, why did you take that as your first action? What were you thinking? Why did you do that? Why did you reach out to them first? When you met with them, what's the first thing you said? How did you build trust? There's going to be deep probing. A couple other schools no one probably gets quite as deep into it as Stanford with the behaviorals, but be ready for probing, be ready for follow-up. Finally, and we'll make this quick and then go to questions. That next category, self-awareness questions. This is a term of my own making, self-awareness. But here you might see questions like, how would you describe your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? What characteristics do you think make up a good leader? What characteristics do you think make up a good team? What would your colleagues say about you? What would your boss say about you? What are your main strengths and main weaknesses? These are kind of self-awareness questions that I think, again, you'll see patterns around for specific schools, and you want to be able to address and cover. Here, I like for people to think about branding it, elaborating on it, and possibly offering a mini example or a referential example to illustrate the point. So if they ask you what your leadership style is, brand it. That means answer the question directly. They said, what is your leadership style? Don't beat around the bush. Don't bury the lead, as they might say in journalism. Answer the question right away. Are there certain adjectives that you would apply to your leadership style? If they say, how would your colleagues describe you? Brand it, answer it. What 3 adjectives would they use to describe you? Say what those 3 adjectives are. Then elaborate on it. What do you mean by those? What do they reflect about you? Brand it, elaborate on it. And sometimes, if appropriate, and if length or time allows, and you could do so without being too long-winded, think about a referential example, a mini example, to support or illustrate what you're saying about your leadership style, about what your colleagues would say about you, or about what role you typically play in a team. These are not, by mini example, I'm drawing a distinction between a behavioral question. Behavioral, the whole example is the answer to the question. Here, the example is a couple of sentences to illustrate the branding and the elaboration that you shared. So brand it, elaborate on it, perhaps offer a mini example to illustrate the point. So those are 3 common buckets of questions: the core 5, behavioral questions, self-awareness questions. I think that if you look through those interview reports like I've talked about, you're going to see that 90% of questions fall into those categories. There's another 10%, it's kind of a miscellaneous, and different schools have different patterns with that. If you had 2 minutes with the admissions committee, what would you say to them? There could be kind of these quirky questions. What are you most passionate about? If you could have lunch with anyone in the world, like these are some miscellaneous things that could come up. The passions, by the way, probably should show up in that last part of your tell me about yourself at the very beginning. So you probably have covered those already. Last little note, and I guess you could say plug here up on the screen. You can visit avantiprep.com to review our interview prep services or sign up for a free consultation. Interview season is upon us. So we are very actively, I mentioned both Friday and this morning leading up right up to this, very actively engaged in interview prep. They are extremely deep, extremely thorough sessions. We said kind of a PhD in interview, but that's really kind of what we're trying to get at and work through and help you develop your responses and fine tune and think about strategy and think about messaging and how do you make sure who you are comes across. I would say you could look around. I think it's probably the most thorough and comprehensive and school-tailored and you-tailored interview prep session out there. It is 3 hours. They usually go even longer. We divide it usually between 2 days. I think a lot of the others you might encounter are 30-minute mock interview, 30 minutes of feedback, 30-minute mock interview, 60 minutes of feedback. Like I said, just this morning, we spent 90 minutes just on the core 5 questions. So a lot to cover, super deep, very valuable. Be confident, but not overconfident. Be positive, be yourself. Make sure your authentic self comes across in these interviews. And let's turn it there to questions from the crowd, and we'll spend, maybe 20 odd minutes on this. And I believe if you hang tight for a minute, the questions should come up on the screen there, and I can address them. All right, question number 1. Do you think one should use a Zoom background or not, especially if we don't have a green screen? I have never worked with anyone who has used a Zoom background in an MBA interview. I think that they have come slightly more in vogue, I guess, because of COVID and people working from home and using Zoom backgrounds. I'm going to say no. I don't think so. People aren't really judging your background unless it was like somehow chaotic and they couldn't hear you. Good enough lighting, clear connection, good squaring to the screen on your part. I could probably even do a little bit better with that myself. You don't want to be too close. You don't want to be too meek or too far away. As far as background is concerned, I think any natural, normal background, interviewers totally understand, especially in the pandemic world, that you're interviewing from home, you're picking the best spot you can. You might be doing it from your apartment or even your parents' house or whatever the case may be. I think pick a reasonable location, make sure the lighting's good, make sure you're square. I don't think you need to go the route of a Zoom background. But on this topic, by the way, and I probably, again, could have been doing a little bit better job with this myself, eye contact during video interviews is a little trickier, but still very important. Depending on the system we're using, and sometimes it'll be Skype, sometimes it'll be an interview system that they have, you want to try to train your eyes on the camera so that you create the feeling on the part of the interviewer that you're making eye contact as you would in a normal face-to-face interaction. So there are a variety of tactics for this. Sometimes I like to take my screen, like that the interview is running through, make it, somewhat smaller, and put it right below. My camera's on the top of my computer. I like to put it right below the lens so that if I'm looking at the person on the video screen, it creates the impression that I am making eye contact with them in real life. What we wouldn't want, I'm going to move my camera right now to the bottom left-hand corner of my screen. And if it were down there, that would seem a little bit silly. I'm making eye contact with the screen or with the interviewer in this case, but it looks like I'm looking away. So what we want to do is try to create as much of an eye contact feeling as we would. That's, they know, again, it's a little trickier with computers and stuff, but there's just a subconscious effect to that, an engaged effect, a confidence. So really try to, pay attention to that eye contact piece as well. Can I mention any MOOC completed by the school to which I'm applying for an MBA, MS? Yeah, I think sure, you could. I don't know that it would necessarily be like a huge, I think it's worth mentioning. It's probably more of a weave-in. I'm trying to think where that might come into play. I'm thinking when you talk about why that school, and if you're talking about a knowledge bucket, you might say that, you might be articulating a gap and how that school is going to fill that particular gap. You might briefly say, one way that I've begun to prepare in this area or build in this area is by taking, Wharton's online course in blank. That's helped me fill the gap a little bit, but I really still need an MBA and I really need Wharton so I think there's a weave in somewhere where that could be, or if perhaps there was something about the MOOC, like about a certain professor or something about the culture, the community, the way of thinking. I don't know, if my own alma mater, Berkeley Haas, if something about the MOOC highlighted or the way they approached the topic resonated with a question the status quo kind of idea, which is one of Haas's 4 defining principles, maybe you could say how taking the MOOC really kind of alerted you to how thinking through the lens of this value or theme is such a big part of the program. This would be maybe then show up and really then draw you. But you'd want to then use it. You're in all these situations, you're using it as a weave-in to transition to a bigger point or a more important point. But I think it's totally fine to mention it. Could perhaps fit well into a narrative. Just don't let it be like, I wouldn't make it one of the core tenets on which your your argument lies. But it's a good weave-in. How much does the interview count in the process? And do you have any major strategies for older applicants, early 30s with 10 years experience? As far as how much does it count? Great question. Let me throw a few things at you there. I think a first thing to think about is a lot of people think because most schools have invite-only interviews, a lot of people think about, I've passed through the application phase and now I'm interviewed, and they're like going to yay or nay me. They're going to accept me or ding me based on that interview. That's not really the case. I would say the case is you've applied, they've liked your application, your essays, your recommendations, your story, your goals, your fit, etc., enough to invite you to interview. You interview, they take the interview report and put it back in the pool. It's another data point. It goes back in the pool with everything else, and now they're going to re-review everything in aggregate. So in theory, I guess you could have, if you had some cracks in your application, they say, okay, they're good enough to interview, we want to interview them. And then they have a great interview, but those cracks were big enough to like still not get you in. People sometimes say, well, I felt like I had a great interview. Why did I get waitlisted or dinged? Well, remember, the interview is going back in the pool with everything else, and it's all viewed in aggregate. I believe there was a survey out there years ago where they had admissions consultants or even adcoms quantify the value of the interview. I'm probably misquoting this or misremembering. I feel like it said like 20%, but I think that would just be misleading to think about that. I'm going to sound like an admissions person now, but the application process is holistic. It's all of these things kind of taken in aggregate: your work experience, your recommendations, your scores, your promotions, your impact at work, your leadership, your community, your goals, your clarity of goals, your fit, and the interview as well. So I think it's hard to put a number on it in that sense, but if I had to throw a number out there, I think you could Google that. I think there was a survey somewhere around 20% is the number they might have put on it. Strategies for older applicants. Great question. I think a question that permeates the application at large, as well as the interview. If you're really feel like you're an outlier, again, everyone can go to the class profile page of the MBA program that you're interested in. You're going to see usually an average, a mean or median number of years of work experience. For most US programs, it's around 5 years of experience. You'll sometimes see a middle 80% range, a 10th percentile to a 90th percentile. That's going to be 3 to 7 years for Columbia, 3.5 to 7 years for Kellogg, 3 to 8 for Berkeley Haas, 3 to 8 and change for Carnegie Mellon Tepper. They're all kind of in that range. If you feel like you're an outlier there, that's probably something you should be aware of and strategize around during your application. Why now? Why MBA? Why now? Why now is a big piece of this in the interview, in the application. You probably want to play some offense on that. You probably want to be proactive about even tipping your cap and acknowledging, I understand that I'm a bit of an outlier from, an age and work experience perspective, but here's why I nevertheless believe that a full-time 2-year MBA program makes sense right now in my career. That might end up in your goals essay. You might it could even be recommenders. If they think that now makes sense for you, they might comment on it. And if it's really material, it might even be something you tackle in an optional essay. You don't necessarily need 500 words about it, but some chunk and some really reasoned rationale around why now. Could it be that your goals are some combination perhaps of goals becoming super clear, you're ready to proceed toward them and achieve them? Could it be that the confluence of your experiences have given you now the ability to not only achieve those goals, but recruit well into what you're targeting? Could it be also that the combination of these experiences give you a platform to make unique and meaningful contributions to your MBA class, this experience? So how would that play in? Could it be that there's no substitute for the 2-year experience from a recruiting perspective? You want to have a reasoned rationale for that with really crystallized points. As the interview goes, I think you want to make sure those get in there as well. They're going to see your resume usually. So they're going to see, hey, your graduation year of college. So I would play a little bit of offense on that. Make that part of your messaging. Even if they don't ask necessarily, you might look for an opportunity to weave that in or acknowledge that. Some caveats, by the way, like if you were in the military, military applicants tend to be a little bit older. I think that's more understandable. You probably have to play less offense on that. If somebody spent 8 years in the military or 10 years in the military, okay, you still want to be really clear about why now, but I think it would be less of a schools are more used to seeing military applicants in this example trend a little bit older. So a few layers to that response. Hope it helped. Any rough estimate on the odds of getting admitted after the interview? According to a survey we did on GMAT Club a few years back, an average M7 applicant has a 50% chance of getting in after an interview. That is the number I would have cited had you not put it into the document there. It can vary, certainly school to school. For folks who peruse the internet for all things MBA related, MBA Data Guru is a website that tries to quantify some of this stuff as well. There's some great studies on GMAT Club too that try to put numbers to these things. I think if you took kind of a cross school average, maybe M7, it's a little lower than 50, but like T15, T20, around 50 feels fair to me. By the way, take some things with a grain of salt too. Like if you're looking at interview data, Kellogg interviews everybody or almost everybody. Tuck had prior to this year the opportunity for anyone who came to campus to interview. Fuqua, UNC Kenan Flagler, other schools have open interviews. Darden, if you apply early, so you gotta really make sure you're reading the data correctly, but roughly around that, something like a 2 and 5, maybe a 1 and 2 shot if you make it to the interview round. That varies though too by demographics as well. That's probably, okay, overarching number, probably somewhere around there. Though I think like Harvard and Stanford kind of quibbled with the MBA Data Guru number when it came out, but rough justice, probably somewhere around there. But take numbers with a grain of salt. Think about demographics and things of that nature. I know for Indian applicants in particular, GMAT Club has another great study, which is they looked at the top 50 programs in the US. This was like 2 years ago. Top 20 and the next 30. And they looked at admit data for Indian applicants by GMAT score, by industry, by a variety of other factors, by age even. And you could kind of interpolate on the chart what you see a percentage interviewed and you see a percentage admitted. I think usually it was closer to like 40% of who was invited to interview got in, or possibly even lower than that. So rough justice probably around there if we look in aggregate, but there's no perfect data. Only the schools really know. I wish we had perfect data, certainly, but that's about how I'd characterize that. We are running out of time, so we'll take a couple of more questions. I'm good certainly for a few more minutes if folks are okay with that. So maybe we'll do 2 more questions. Oh, great question from Ankit. I generally find it difficult when the interviewer asks, do you have any questions for us? How to go about this? So I mentioned this earlier in the interview, earlier in the presentation. I'd almost think of it potentially as like a 4th bucket of, we talked about the core 5, we talked about behavioral, we talked about self-awareness. Let's think about the questions that you ask them. Essentially, every school will give you the opportunity, I think almost really without fail, you'll have the opportunity, unless like you ran out of time and the person had to run, for questions for them at the end. So let's think about a few things here. I like for people so you should certainly think about questions in advance. If you know whether who your interviewer is, it could be a current student, it could be an alum, It could be an admissions person. If you know who it is in advance, or at least the type of person it is, you could even tailor a little bit to that, especially if it's a current student. You could look at their LinkedIn. You could see where they're, or an alum for that matter, or admissions person. You could look at everyone's LinkedIn. But you should definitely think about questions in advance. You could potentially tailor them to the type of interviewer that you have. I like for people, I suggest as a default to have at least 3 questions in mind, but to start with 2, and you kind of have to read the room. And when I say start with 2, by the way, ask one, let them answer, ask the next one, let them answer. Sometimes, I know when I'm doing mock interviews, sometimes I say to people, do you have any questions for me? And they say like 6 questions in a row. And I say, whoa, wait a second. If I were your real interviewer, I wouldn't even remember those questions. So one at a time, ask the question, let them answer. Ask the next question, let them answer. That's 2 thoughtful questions. Now you kind of have to read the room. If they blocked off 45 minutes on your calendar and it started at 1 o'clock and it's 1:42, you should probably be polite and say something like, yeah, I just want to be cognizant of your time or respectful of your time. I know we had a stop on the calendar for 1:45. Would it be okay if I asked one more question? Or do we have time for one more question? So I like to start with 2, read the room, maybe permission the 3rd or be polite or respectful about the 3rd. But conversely too, like you don't want to cut yourself short. I think in non-COVID times, if you're interviewing with an alum on like a Saturday morning at a coffee shop and you guys are, have great chemistry and you're talking about the school and they clearly have nowhere to go and they're really enjoying talking about their program, don't cut yourself short either. Have the conversation, let it happen. So you do have to have situational awareness and social awareness around that. But for like a typical video interview where they probably, you have an admissions person who has an interview at 1 and an interview at 2, or you have a student interviewing you and they have interview at 1 and a class at 2. 2 is a nice place to start, maybe permission the 3rd. Other things on this, be thoughtful about your questions. You don't want to ask questions that you should already know the answer to, or that are like super obvious on the website. Like the rudimentary stuff, you should already know. You're interviewing here. You just, you should be beyond that. Let's try to connect the dots. Let's try to think about thoughtful and interesting questions that you could ask here. I also like to remind people the preface to the question can sometimes be as important as the question itself. So if you've done some extra research or had some extra conversations with people around, a certain topic or a certain offering, and now you're really going to ask a pointed or probing question about it. Or let's say you were really intrigued by the way a certain school kind of advertised its integration, a certain MBA program advertised its integration with the rest of the university. You might preface the question by saying, one thing that's really stood out to me over the course of my conversations with current students over the past few months, or if it was one specific, over my course of my conversation with John Smith, one of your student ambassadors 2 weeks ago, was the level of integration that MIT Sloan as an MBA program has with the rest of the university. I'd be curious to know, now maybe MIT Sloan is not a perfect example here because you're usually going to have an admissions person interviewing you. I meant this maybe more for a current student, but if you ask the current student, well, what in your experience in what ways have you kind of integrated with or interacted with the rest of the university, and how have you found that added to your MBA, unique value to your MBA experience? So the point of that was to illustrate the power of the preface, the importance of the preface. The preface helps you show, don't talk for don't prolong the preface, but within the preface, you could kind of show that you know these other things about the school, that you're connecting the dots, that you had another conversation, and now you're asking a more focused or probing question about it. So go a little deeper, connect the dots, tailor the question to the person you're interviewing with. Certainly this is a topic we'd cover in great detail over the course of interview prep as well. How do I approach the question, which other colleges have I applied to and why? Very good question there. This is a question that It comes up sometimes. I would say in a minority of instances. I don't know, 20% of the time or something. But it's a good one to be ready for and to think about. There are different schools of thought on this. Just to be blunt about it, there's my feeling, honesty is always the best policy. That goes for all parts of your applications, by the way. Everything has to be you and true and authentic. If it's not, they're going to feel that. They're going to know that. It's going to come across. As it relates to this particular question, I think as much as the where else have you applied, the why you've done that, even if they don't ask why, is equally important. You could kind of get into some talking points around the specific 2 or 3 specific things that you really valued in a school, or how you went about choosing the programs that you're interested in and felt resonated with you. You might want to, if it's true, use that as an opportunity to reinforce that the program you're interviewing with, again, only if it's true, is your top choice. So I think thoughtfulness around the why. Is it something about the offerings? Is it something about the class size? Is it something about the community or the location? If that, look for the consistent logic that exists between the schools to which you've applied. They're all really strong in blank. And this was a huge filter as I went through my, school research and engagement strategy over the past 6 months. And as I spoke with current students and attended events, I was really focused on looking for programs that had these 2 things or these 3 things. That's how I landed on this set of programs. But as I've discussed over the course of today's interviews, I hope I've made clear, I would like to reinforce that I believe your program is the best of that. Again, only if you mean it. Admittedly, do people sometimes, if they've applied to 6 schools or 7 or 8 schools, do you need to name every single school? You don't. You could articulate a subset of those programs. Some people do select that route, or make some strategic decisions like that, or if they're, I don't know, sometimes embarrassed, I applied to 10 schools. So that's my thinking there. But again, throughout your applications, honesty is effectively, it is required. You're signing an oath from an honor standpoint, and an ethical standpoint. Throughout your applications, honesty, authenticity, deeply revealing who you are, your thought processes, your goals, your passions, your purposes, your experiences, how they've shaped you. The interview is an opportunity to cover a variety of those topics, to be professional, but also to make sure your personality comes across. Never be silly. Don't be silly. But make sure you come across, your energy comes across as well. I know that's a little harder through the screen than it is in person. Be confident, but not overconfident. Be yourself. Be positive. If you prepare, trust your preparation. And I wish everybody the best of luck. We hope to have the opportunity to interact with you through interview prep. For interview prep, as I've mentioned, avantiprep.com. You can see some links there up on the screen for a free consultation and/or to schedule or sign up for interview prep. You could do all of that directly through the website as well. And if it's not interview prep and it's round 2 applications, we'd love to work with you on all of that as well. So avantiprep.com, free consultation, testimonials. Feel free to sign up. We wish everybody the best of luck and hope to speak with you again soon.